IB Environmental students, let's get fishy and talk about aquatic food resources. There are two major role players in this that I want to mention at first, which are phytoplankton, which are our autotrophs or producers, and they make most of the photosynthesis happen in the ocean. And we also have zooplankton, which are zoo for animals, which are the consumers, primary consumers in the food chain. And a lot of us don't remember these microscopic organisms, so I wanted to define them and make sure we see them even in our Chesapeake Bay food web that's local to us. So as we talk about different example marine ecosystems, note that these guys are players in every single one of them, even though they're so tiny. So here are some example marine ecosystems. We have intertidal zones, which are going to splish splash as waves come on and off, and these different organisms have to deal with sometimes having water and sometimes not. We also have mangroves, which are really cool because these really neat trees that can deal with being in the water, provide habitat and flood protection to those areas, and oftentimes they're getting currently deforested to build fisheries, which is no good. We also have our estuaries like Chesapeake Bay, where we have fresh water meeting salt water, and we call that brackish, and that's a very unique ecosystem. We have lagoons, which are like these almost lake areas, but they're actually sometimes going to be slightly different because they're actually cut off by a reef or sandy area. We have coral reefs, which are beautiful and biodiverse, and they provide large ecosystems that have wonderful resources, but unfortunately are disappearing due to climate change and acidification of the oceans. We have deep oceans, which are really unique because they have a lot less sunlight and productivity, and they have a lot of our really cool large organisms such as whales and dolphins and seals. So lots and lots of different types of marine ecosystems. Our focus is going to be talking about fisheries, but just know that these different ecosystems are all different. To compare, let's talk about the area where the intertidal zone meets the deep sea, which is called the continental shelf. This area is going to have a lot of those types of big organisms and also microscopic ones. It's really productive for the most part because it has a lot of tidal action, which creates some nutrients in the water. It also has that shallow aspect, which has a lot more light for photosynthesis. That is compared to the deep ocean, which is lower productivity. Do know that that deeper outer ocean area isn't owned by a country, and we're going to talk about that too. Let's learn more about these things. So when we're talking about fishing, we're talking about so many different types of things we can fish. We're not going to be able to talk about all of them, but note that there's lots of things people fish for. So fishery refers to any type of harvest of fish type organism. It can be also not only wild, but it could be aquaculture or fish farming. So locally we have a large fishing industry for menhaden in Reedville, Virginia, which is weird because you've never heard of menhaden probably, but it's used for making things like cat food and fish oil pills. And the menhaden are really struggling in our area because they're being overfished like this with a trawl net. So 90% of the fisheries occur in the oceans. They're a super large source of protein for many food diets, but they're being exploited at a really large unsustainable rate, largely due to technologies and an increasing diet in more economically developed countries like our own, because a lot of us are stopping eating as much pork and chicken and so forth and beef, and we're growing this yum diet of fish. But guess what? If we do that everywhere, there's not going to be enough fish in the ocean. So we have started, instead of wild catching fish, doing fish farms, but we can talk about that fish farms aren't necessarily always going to be the best method. So why are we in the wild doing unsustainable commercial fishing methods? What are those methods? So dredging is taking a big net and dragging it along the bottom. So this one is kind of close to being a dredging net. It's not perfect because it doesn't have a bottom metal bag. But picture a metal piece on the bottom really digging into the seafloor. It's very damaging and it captures pretty much anything. Gill nets are somewhat similar to this one, and they're going to capture the organisms by the gills. The holes are a little bit larger, but unfortunately it catches unwanted organisms such as turtles, which is really, really not nice, right? And then we have things like trawl nets, which are a bit more common these days. They don't drag across the bottom. They try not to capture the wrong organisms by using stuff like sonar and GPS, trying to figure out what schools of fish are nearby, but they can catch any organism that comes through it. Blast fishing uses explosive. It's really damaging to the under area of the ocean, like coral, and it can be really bad because it kills some fish, right? So the big idea here is that there's lots of different technologies, and things like spotter planes and sonar, they're going to make it so that nowadays we can catch pretty much any fish in our path, and it allows us to really get them and get them fast. And because of that, there's very little fish now in our oceans. It's hard to see, but believe it, they're almost all disappearing. And so now a lot of fish that you buy in the store is not wild caught, it's fish farmed. So what is aquaculture or fish farming, and is it okay? So here are some benefits. We don't have to waste all of the leftover yucky parts of things like chicken and beef. We can make them into fish food or fish meal, so that stuff doesn't become fish food waste. We can try to use carnivorous fish sometimes in here by getting nutrients from other sources, such as like by eating small other fish in the aquaculture area. China is using this really cool symbiotic mutualistic practice, mutualism meaning lots of things are benefiting, by putting its fish in the rice paddy fields, which allows the fish to poop and create fertilizer for the rice. It allows the rice to create a habitat for the fish, which lowers the needs of fossil fuels because these people don't have to do as much work because the rice and the fish are helping each other, and they lower the need for pesticides, antibiotics, and fertilizer, which are all pollutants. So way, way cool if you do it in this cool, really nice mutualistic way. But guess what? A lot of places aren't doing it this way, and they're doing it in this big, crazy factory-looking system, which looks more like this. So there are lots of negative impacts for fish farming or aquaculture. A lot of times we're picking things like salmon and tuna that are these giant carnivorous fish that need tons of energy and other food, and it's very wasteful energetically, and we'll talk more about that in class. A lot of times to build these fish farms, we have to kill things like mangrove habitats to have this space. We have all this types of pollution and disease by putting these fish in these large areas, and they get sick and we have to medicate them. Sometimes to make them grow faster, bigger, stronger, we make them genetically modified, and then they might breed and escape with wild fish, which would then we'd call them invasives. So not so good. So here's an example. We have Pacific salmon, and they live on the west coast of the U.S. They are now considered endangered in the wild because we've overfished them so much. A lot of that is also due to deforestation for urbanization and building of cities, and also because of dams. These salmon like to migrate upstream. They're really beautiful and cool, but now the building of dams for electric power and holding water in California is causing it so that these fish don't have a path to swim upstream. So now, because they're endangered in the wild and we don't want to fish them anymore, but they're so yummy, we are starting to build these fish farms for salmon. And that is what you more than likely would find at the store if you were trying to buy salmon. So a lot of the salmon, if you find them at the grocery store, you'll see that they're not wild caught. You have to pay a lot more for wild caught salmon, and they're farm raised, these salmon we find at the grocery store. What are our concerns over that? Well, those farmed salmon can escape to the wild and be invasive. Sometimes they're even genetically modified. They could cause viral or bacterial infections if they escape into the wild because they're so closely farmed that they get those things very often, and that they have a lot of chemicals in them due to antibiotics in the fish pellets that they're eating, because remember, salmon are high up the food chain and they need lots and lots and lots of food to be able to grow. They're like the lions of the sea. They are really high up on the food chain. So that being said, not a good situation. We have to definitely think as a society about what to do if we want to keep eating fish at the rate we are, because we are now growing them like we grow chickens in these cages, which is crazy. So due to overfishing, the UN created this convention, UNCLOS, to declare what is owned by who in order to fish, because we're noticing that things are getting overfished. So the continental shelf right here is this area that starts to decline as we go deeper into the ocean. Well, what country owns that water? It's not on the land, so who owns what? So they decided that 200 nautical miles out from the land would be owned by the country that the land is. And the area past that is considered not owned by any country and is considered international waters. Well, because that's not always super clear, before that and even since, there have been a lot of international conflicts. So beforehand, there were things called the Cod Wars that were between 1950s and 1970s that kind of made that convention happen, because the Britain and Iceland were fighting over the fish cod, and they were really getting angry, and the fishing boats were almost becoming like war boats. Crazy. And halibut, which sometimes is caught in Alaska near us, but is in Canada and Spain, they were fighting over halibut, sometimes called turbo, and Canada and Spain started firing on each other. Look at this article. Canada to Spain. We're watching you. Oh my goodness. And recently China has been building their fishing fleet so much because it's such a part of their diet that they have been freaking out places like Indonesia, Philippines, the Japanese, Koreans, and Russia, because China has been putting these giant fishing boats, which look very intimidating, way too close to the 200 nautical mile mark for these other nations. So very contentious. Well, because we're overfishing, we have to relate this to tragedy commons, which is the conflict between the individual need for food versus the common good of society. Are we overfishing? Is that because I'm sometimes thinking that I have a resource that belongs to myself versus belonging to all? So the waters, it's hard to know who things belong to, and because of that, we overuse it and exploit it. So the oceans are a really good example of that, and water as a whole. To help us with that, we can think about how much we really should be fishing, which is called maximum sustainable yield. Sustainable yield is defined as the amount of natural capital or natural resource that can be extracted within a single year without depleting the original amount or stock to the point where it's non-replenishable. So how much fish can I fish without making it so I won't have enough fish for the future? We did this with our goldfish activity at the beginning of the year. So the maximum sustainable yield is the largest yield or catch that I should be able to get from our species stock or our amount of wild fish without permanently depleting the stock. Unfortunately, we have been fishing past that maximum sustainable fishing amount, which has caused us to not have enough fish for the future. So I should fish so that my fish can get back to carrying capacity as quick as possible. This is easier said than done because carrying capacity is not always a clear amount. So generally, that is half of the carrying capacity. So I should only fish half of what I probably think I should fish because I need my fish to be able to reproduce. So to do that, I can calculate maximum sustainable yield, but it's super hard. We're going to talk about this more in class. So I can look at the annual growth of the population, which is related to births and how many fish are immigrating or coming into the population. And I can minus the death and how many are leaving the population. So this is really confusing stuff, I agree, but really I should only fish what I need to, right, so that my fish come back to carrying capacity. It is thought that usually harvesting at that maximum sustainable yield mark will cause a decline in the overall population over time because really it's so hard to calculate this amount, and I'm going to accidentally probably not estimate well, and it's going to cause overfishing, right? Because population's resources fluctuate. There could be a giant storm. There could be climate change, all right? It's difficult to measure the actual population size to even know carrying capacity. We know Lincoln Index is pretty hard to do. It's also hard to take into account of the age and the health of the organisms and how many female organisms are there. If there are not enough females, they're not going to be able to repopulate well. It's also hard to think that maybe there's a disease that could hit. For instance, oysters in the Chesapeake Bay got hit by a crazy disease over the last 20 years and has made it really hard to do any sort of catches by the oyster industry. So therefore, it's really hard to calculate, but it's really good to make sure we underestimate and make our catching legislation below maximum sustainable yield. So as we talk about legislation in class, we're going to want optimum sustainable yield to be below this amount so that we can moderately fish so that we're sustainable. And we'll talk about how you can make your fishing and eating decisions so that we have fish for future generations. See you in class.